hockey.
Chapter 1, George and Harold. Meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. George and Harold were best friends. They had a lot in common. They lived right next door to each other, and they were both in the same 4th grade class at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. George and Harold were usually responsible kids. Whenever anything bad happened, George and Harold were usually responsible. But don't get the wrong idea about these two. George and Harold were actually very nice boys. No matter what everybody else thought, they were good, sweet, and lovable. Well, okay, maybe they weren't so sweet and lovable, but they were good nonetheless. It's just that George and Harold each had a silly streak a mile long. Usually that silly streak was hard to control. Sometimes it got them into trouble. And once it got them into big, big trouble. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2, Treehouse Comics, Inc. After a hard day of cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and causing mayhem at school, George and Harold liked to rush to the old treehouse in George's backyard. Inside the treehouse were 2 big old fluffy chairs, a table, a cupboard crammed with junk food, and a padlock crate filled with pencils, pens, and stacks of paper. Now, Harold loved to draw, and George loved to make up stories. And together, the 2 boys spent hours and hours writing and drawing their very own comic books. Over the years, they had created hundreds of their own comics, starring dozens of their own superheroes. First, there was Dogman. Then came Timmy, the talking toilet. And who could forget the amazing Cow Lady? But the all-time greatest superhero they ever made up had to be the amazing Captain Underpants. George came up with the idea.
Most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear, he said. Well, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear.
The 2 boys laughed and laughed.
Yeah, said Harold. He could fight with wedgie power.
George and Harold spent entire afternoons writing and drawing the comic adventures of Captain Underpants. He was their coolest superhero ever. Luckily for the boys, the secretary at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School was much too busy to keep an eye on the copy machine. So whenever they got a chance, Harold and George would sneak into the office and run off several hundred copies of their latest Captain Underpants adventure. After school, they sold their homemade comics on the playground for 50 cents each. Don't miss our next exciting adventure. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Coming soon to a playground near you. Chapter 4, Mean Old Mr. Krupp. Do you see that old guy looking out the window up there? That's Mr. Krupp, the principal. Now, Mr. Krupp was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. He hated laughter and singing. He hated the sounds of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. Guess which 2 children Mr. Krupp hated most of all? If you guessed George and Harold, you're right. Mr. Krupp hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks
pranks and their wisecracks. He hated their silly attitudes and their constant giggling. And he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm going to get those boys one day, Mr. Krupp vowed. One day. Very, very soon. Chapter 5. One day, very, very soon. Remember when I said that George and Harold's silly streak got them into big, big trouble once? Well, this is the story of how that happened, and how some huge pranks and a little blackmail turned their principal into the coolest superhero of all time. It was the day of the big football game between the bleachers were filled with fans. The cheerleaders ran onto the field and shook pom-poms over their heads. A fine black dust drifted out of their pom-poms and settled all around them. "Give me a K," shouted the cheerleaders. "K," repeated the fans. "Give me an N," shouted the cheerleaders. "N," repeated the fans. "Give me an sneezed the cheerleaders. Repeated the fans. The cheerleaders